Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Scythians, Nomad Warriors of the Steppe, by Barry Cunliffe, narrated by Matthew Waterson. Preface. Many years ago, as a young undergraduate at Cambridge, I came across a brief reference in a series of essays written by Gordon Childe to horsemen who had moved westwards from the Pontic steppe and had established themselves in Hungary at the end of the Bronze Age. I was surprised to find that none of my teachers at Cambridge had any interest in, or indeed much knowledge of, the subject, so I decided to follow it up, as far as I could, from published sources and to make it my own. That which we discover for ourselves, we cherish. So began a lifelong fascination with the warrior nomads of the steppe. Some years later, in the early 1970s, I managed to arrange a brief study trip to Hungary, then still under Soviet control, the first of many visits to Eastern Europe to meet colleagues and to establish academic links. It was in the National Museum in Budapest, looking in awe at two great gold stags brought to northern Hungary by horsemen from the steppe, that the brilliance and energy of the Scythian world first really struck home. Thereafter, I've dogged the footsteps of the Scythians in the Ukraine and the Crimea, and across Central Asia as far as Mongolia. I have also made pilgrimages to two of the world's greatest collections of Scythian art, in the State Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg and the Museum of Historical Treasures in Kiev. This book is my homage to these remarkable people. To an educated Greek, the Scythians were one of the four great peoples of the barbarian world. They were well known. Scythian archers were frequently depicted on Attic, black-figured pottery, and historians like Herodotus recorded stories from their history, exploring with undisguised delight their unusual behavior and beliefs. Nowadays, Scythians are seldom in our consciousness. They are hardly represented in our museum collections, and only rarely are they the subject of temporary exhibitions. Recently, in 2017, the British Museum has hosted a brilliant exhibition, Scythian Warriors of Ancient Siberia, from the State Hermitage Museum, St. Petersburg. Before that, one has to go back to the Frozen Tombs exhibition of 1978. America has been rather better served, but even so the wonders of Scythian culture are seldom seen in the West. There are many reasons for this. The difficulty and expense of mounting international displays must rank large, but there are also cultural reasons. The Scythians were largely nomads, constantly on the move and frequently covering large distances. They left no cities or monumental architecture. For most people in the world today, leading sedentary, urban lives, nomadism is difficult to comprehend. It is much easier to empathize with Greeks and Romans or even Egyptians or Aztecs. The Scythians are other, alien and therefore a little unnerving, best left on the margin where they belong. Yet, to the Greeks, it was just this that made them so fascinating, and rightly so. I hope that this book will go some way in making the world of the Scythian nomads a little more accessible and understandable, and will encourage at least some to explore for themselves the wonders of Scythian culture and the breathtaking steppe landscape in which they lived. Barry Cunliffe, Oxford, April 2018. 1. Discovering the Scythians. In April 1698, a tall young man, 26 years old, untidily dressed and with hands scratched and scarred through hard work, decided to take time off from studying shipbuilding in the Deptford and Greenwich yards on the Thames to visit Oxford with a small group of friends. The party stayed in the Golden Cross Inn in Cornmarket, where they evidently had a convivial evening, and the next morning set out to visit the Ashmolean Museum, then in Broad Street. The museum had been opened 15 years earlier under the patronage of Elias Ashmole to house his Cabinet of Curiosities, inherited from the collector John Tradescant. The visit to the museum was brief, but the group had attracted notice, and by the time they left to cross the road to visit Trinity College Chapel, a large crowd had gathered. Irritated by the attention, the young man decided to return to London to immerse himself once more in the intricacies of shipbuilding. He was Peter Alexievich, Tsar of Russia, later to be known as Peter the Great. Peter was an intellectual and a man of action. He had realized that for his country to grow in the modern world, it would have to become a great sea power. Since its few ports on the icebound White Sea were far from adequate, he set his heart on establishing a navy on the Black Sea, an ambition which meant confronting the Ottomans, who then controlled the region. Later in his reign he was to turn his attention to the Baltic and the Caspian Sea, involving Russia in wars with Sweden and Persia. It was his early realization of the importance of sea power that led him to take a deep interest in shipbuilding. In 1697 he travelled incognito to Western Europe with a small delegation, known as the Grand Embassy, to learn about the West and to establish new alliances. His interest in maritime technology led him to spend time in Amsterdam, in the shipyards of the Dutch East India Company, as well as in the London dockyards. Later he visited Malta to study the Knights of St. John and their fleet, and even considered the possibility of setting up a Russian naval base on the island. It was in Amsterdam in 1697 that Peter's other great interest in collecting scientific curiosities and antiquities began to develop. There he met the great Dutch collector Jacob de Wilde, whose collection of scientific instruments, antiquities, coins and medals he is said later to have acquired. It was this fascination with curiosities that drew him on that spring day to visit Ashmole's Museum in Oxford. Like many educated men of the time, Peter became an eclectic collector of curiosities, amassing works of fine and applied art, artifacts, items of Oriental culture, and naturalia, especially human malformations, which were eventually displayed in the Kunstkamera, Cabinet of Curiosities, a grand structure built on the banks of the Neva in St. Petersburg, opened in 1727, 2 years after Peter's death. The collection remained there until December 1859, when it was moved to the Winter Palace, but on the orders of Tsar Alexander II, it was transferred the next year to the Hermitage. One part of Peter's collection, to which he was particularly attached, was a group of artifacts, mainly of gold, which came from Siberia. It was handed over to the Academy of Sciences in 1723, eventually passing to the Hermitage, where it is still displayed as the Siberian collection of Peter the Great. Siberia was a vast region, sparsely populated by nomadic tribes. Russian conquest had begun in 1581-2 under Ivan IV, the Terrible, and by the middle of the 17th century, under official encouragement, the flow of Russian settlers had increased, attracted by the many economic opportunities which the virgin territory had to offer. Rumours that there were gold artifacts to be found in ancient grave mounds soon began to circulate, and it was not long before the commanders of the communities of Tomsk and Krasnoyarsk began to organize bands of mound diggers, bugrovshchiki, to dig into the many kurgans, burial mounds, scattered about the landscape in search of treasure. One report, sent from Tobolsk to Tsar Alexei in 1670, speaks of much gold and silver being dug out of Tatar graves by the Russians. 6 years earlier, a Dutchman, Nicolaas Witsen, had spent a year in Russia as part of the Dutch embassy and, developing a deep interest in the country and its culture, had begun to collect artifacts emanating from Siberia. He continued to do so through Russian agents long after he had returned home. How civilized must have been the people who buried these rarities, he wrote. The gold objects are so artfully and sensibly ornamented that I do not think European craftsmen could have managed better. Witsen was a prominent citizen in Amsterdam, serving as mayor of the city on 13 occasions between 1682 and 1706. In 1697, it was he who organized a 4-month attachment for the young Tsar Peter in the shipyards of the Dutch East India Company, and introduced him to other scientists and collectors in the city. Peter will have been well aware of Witsen's collection of Siberian antiquities and tried to acquire it after his death in 1717, but apparently without success. By this time, Peter was himself an avid collector of Siberian gold artifacts. His main supplier was Prince Matvei Petrovich Gagarin, who, as governor of Siberia, lived at Tobolsk, the capital of the province. On one occasion we hear of Gagarin ordering that poor peasants sheltering in a monastery should be sent out to dig into mounds to find gold and silver. The first package he sent to the Tsar contained 10 items. The second, sent in 1716, was more substantial, comprising 172 objects. It was accompanied by a note. Your Majesty has instructed me to search for the old objects buried in the land of ancient treasures. According to this instruction of yours, I am sending you as many gold objects as it has been found. Descriptions of these objects and details of their number and weight are enclosed to this letter. Your Majesty's humblest slave, Matvei Gagarin. A third batch, sent a year later, included 60 gold objects and 2 of silver. Gagarin had been a faithful agent, diligently collecting for his master, but soon fell from favour, and in 1721 was publicly hanged for abuse of authority. But he was not the only supplier of antiquities. Already in 1715, a Siberian mine owner, Alexis Demidov, had presented Peter with 20 gold objects, and more would have arrived from other sources. Peter's fascination with Siberian gold artifacts stemmed from his collector's instincts for accumulating curiosities, but the flow of antiquities also provided material to help him forward his ambition to write a history of Russia and its peoples. The artifacts were research data, and had to be preserved from unscrupulous peasants whose natural inclination was to melt them down and sell the gold, but if they were to be used to write history, it was also necessary to learn something of their context. Thus, in 1718, a decree was issued to bring an end to the plundering of graves. It threatened death to anyone found searching for gold stirrups and cups. Instead, local officials were ordered to collect, from earth and water, old inscriptions, ancient weapons, dishes, and everything old and unusual. Information about the context should be recorded and all objects found be drawn. It was an enlightened attitude, far in advance of Western European practices at the time, but very difficult to enforce. Peter realized this and had already decided to be more proactive in gathering new knowledge. Expeditions to Siberia. The Pioneers. The idea of sending a scientific expedition to Siberia was clearly in Peter's mind when, in 1716, he was spending some time in Danzig, now Gdansk. There he visited the natural scientist and collector Johann Philipp Brain, whose work had gained international acclaim, winning him election as a Fellow of the Royal Society in London. In addition to examining Brain's natural history collection, Peter also sought his advice on setting up a Siberian expedition. Brain recommended that the Tsar should entrust the venture to a German medical doctor, Daniel Gottlieb Messerschmitt, who had helped him build his own collection. Messerschmitt was invited to St. Petersburg, and in November 1718 was charged to travel to Siberia to study the geography, natural history, medicine, medical herbs, diseases, peoples, languages, monuments, and antiquities, to make a description of everything remarkable, and to collect rarities and medical plants. Preparation for this daunting task took some time, but he finally set out in March 1719 for Tobolsk on what was to be a 7-year expedition. In the report, written on his return after Peter's death, he explained his brief more fully. I shall look for herbs and flowers, roots, birds, and so on, and also for ancient burial objects, portrayals of people and animals, Kalmic mirrors. I was ordered to announce in the towns and regions that everybody must bring me such herbs, roots, and flowers and ancient burial things, and if any of them are found worthy, the burial objects shall be paid for generously. In the event he acquired few items of gold, suggesting to him that most of the readily accessible graves had already been robbed. As an inquiring scientist, however, he decided to test this for himself by excavating a number of burial mounds. Although he found little that he considered to be of value, his were the first scientifically driven excavations in Russia, the beginning of modern archaeology. Messerschmitt returned to St. Petersburg in March 1727. His patron, Tsar Peter, had died 2 years earlier, and there was now little enthusiasm for this kind of work, but the records and collections he brought back were assigned to the Kunstkamera, now under the control of the Imperial Academy of Sciences, which had been established in 1724-25. No further resources were made available to him, and he died in poverty in 1735 at the age of 50. The Academy's interests lay elsewhere, with the exploration of the eastern extremities of Asia and the sea passages to China and Japan. In 1725 it had sponsored the first Kamchatka expedition led by the Dane Vitus Bering, after whom the strait between Asia and America was named. The second expedition, which set out in 1733 and was to last for 10 years, was a vast enterprise involving some 3,000 people. Its task to explore eastern Asia, to map the entire Arctic coast of Siberia, and to chart America's northwest coast and islands. The man chosen to oversee the geographical and historical aspects of the work was a 28-year-old German, Gerhard Friedrich Müller, who had for 5 years served as secretary to the Academy. His brief was to describe Siberia's civil history, its antiquities, and the manners and customs of the people. Müller is best known for his ethnographic observations, but having been closely involved with Messerschmitt's archaeological collection when it arrived at the Kunstkamera, he took a particular interest in burial mounds, amassing a collection of his own, mostly restricted to bronze artifacts, since very little gold was now being recovered. Times had changed. I saw a lot of people in Siberia, he explained, who used to do this, grave robbery, for a living. But in my time, nobody was doing it, because all the graves that could have held treasures had already been dug. Nonetheless, his collection was considered to be of scientific value and was bought by the Academy of Sciences in 1748 to be added to the existing Siberian collection housed in the Kunstkamera. Broadening horizons. The Black Sea. By the middle of the 18th century, educated people with access to the Siberian collection were becoming familiar with the distinctive animal art of Siberia, so vividly depicted on metalwork recovered from the kurgans scattered across the steppe. The Russian military advance to the Black Sea during the reign of Catherine the Great, 1762 to 1796, brought many more kurgans into the Russian sphere, and their potential for producing spectacular finds was not lost on the Russian elite, now commanding the new territories. One such was General Alexei Petrovich Melgunov, 1722 to 1788, governor of Novorossiysk, a province of the Ukraine. In 1763 he opened several kurgans at Litoy in the vicinity of Kirovograd, finding in one of them a rich burial of the late 7th or early 6th century BC. It was accompanied by a short iron sword, akinakes, in a gold scabbard decorated with fantastic animals. Such weapons are typical of the Scythians. But at the time little was known of them, and the sword was ascribed to the Scythians. The grave also produced the silver legs of a stool, which can now be identified as coming from the Euratrian region of Asia Minor. Melgunov's finds were displayed in the Kunstkamera in St. Petersburg, where they caused a minor sensation, reminding the world of the riches to be had from the great kurgans of the Pontic steppe, and raising the intriguing question of the relationship between the animal art represented in the Siberian collection and the similar art found in the kurgans in Russia's newly won Black Sea territories. By comparison with the kurgans of Siberia, those in the Pontic steppe were massive and could not fail to impress. One of the largest, Chetornik, near the city of Nikopol in the Ukraine, nearly 20 meters high and 50 meters in diameter, is first mentioned in 1781. In this newfound enthusiasm for the Scythians, Herodotus's Histories, written in Greek in the 5th century BC, which gives an extended account of the Scythian lifestyle, was translated into Russian. The wonders of the Pontic-Caspian region had begun to be more widely appreciated following a program of fieldwork commissioned by Catherine II and carried out by the natural scientist Peter Pallas in 1793-4. His findings were published at the end of the century in German and later in English translation as Travels Through the Southern Province of the Russian Empire, 1802-3. One of his observations was of the remains of the Greek colony of Olbia in the estuary of the Bug, a discovery which stimulated classical scholars to begin to consider the intriguing question of the interaction between the Greeks and the native Scythians, a relationship already known to them through the histories of Herodotus. The civilizing influence of the Russian state, coming after centuries of stultifying Ottoman rule, brought with it many benefits, and not least a new intellectual curiosity, one manifestation of which was the foundation of museums in the flourishing port cities of the Black Sea, Nikolaev in 1806, Theodosia in 1811, Odessa in 1825, and Kerch in 1826. These provided the inspiration for collecting and for excavation. The earliest of the excavations, which can fairly be said to have kick-started Scythian studies, was carried out at the kurgan of Kul-Oba in 1830 by a team of amateurs and museum professionals from the museum at Kerch at the eastern extremity of the Crimean Peninsula. The excavators found a stone-built tomb, probably constructed by Greek masons resident in the nearby town of Pantikapaeum. It dated to the 4th century BC and contained the bodies of a Scythian king, his wife, and a servant, accompanied by a number of gold items. Among the objects recovered were several depicting Scythians, most notably a gold vessel showing bearded, long-haired Scythians wearing trousers, heavy fur coats, and pointed hoods, together with their spears and shields and bow and arrow cases. In one scene, a warrior is shown in the act of stringing his recurved bow. In a second scene, a man is bandaging the leg of a colleague, while a third shows a man attending to the tooth of another person. Also from the tomb was a gold applique plaque showing two men firing their short bows. Here, for the first time, were vivid images of Scythians, as they would have been known to their Greek neighbours. For the fascinated Russian intelligentsia, the Scythians of the Pontic steppe could at last begin to be appreciated as a real people. But to add to the excitement, from beneath the floor of the tomb came a massive gold plaque, which had once decorated a shield or the case for a bow and arrows, depicting a stag with legs folded beneath and antlers streaming across its back. It is a masterpiece of animal art matching the vitality of similar well-known pieces in the Siberian collection. In 1831, the finds from Kul Oba were sent to the Hermitage and put on display before a wondering public. So impressed was the imperial court that it granted 2,000 rubles to fund the continuation of the excavation. Seeing the new finds, and in particular the golden stag, many will have begun to wonder how these Pontic Scythians, enjoying close contacts with the Greeks, related to their contemporaries living a nomadic existence thousands of kilometers away in Siberia. More excavations followed thick and fast. Between 1853 and 1856, the massive kurgan of Alexandropol, 21 meters high, was examined. It was found to have been totally robbed, but around the central grave the excavators found 15 horse burials, their bridles decorated in gold and silver. Those who knew their Herodotus would have been reminded of his descriptions of the slaughter of horses to accompany dead leaders in their graves. Some years later, in 1863, the excavators, who had taken on the challenge of the Chotomlik kurgan, were rewarded with an intact burial chamber of the 4th century BC. One of the stunning discoveries from the tomb was of a gold-hilted iron sword contained in a richly decorated gold sheath depicting a battle between Greeks and Persians and a griffin attacking a stag. The scabbard is almost certainly of Greek workmanship, demonstrating the presence of Greek craftsmen working in the Black Sea colonies to serve the demands of the Scythian elite. Other kurgan excavations were to follow. In the Taman Peninsula, on the east side of the Strait of Kerch, which gives access to the Sea of Azov, the great Bliznitz kurgan was examined between 1864 and 1868. Among the various grave goods recovered, an Iranian seal and an Egyptian amulet showed the extent of the exchange networks then in operation. Immediately to the east, the Kuban region yielded further important discoveries. Excavations began in 1875 on a group of kurgans known as the Seven Brothers. The great mound of Kostromskaya was examined in 1897, and work on kurgans in the vicinity of the village of Kalamez took place from 1903 to 1909. Unlike the burials in the Ukraine, which had mostly been robbed, many of those examined in the North Caucasus were intact. The last of the spectacular excavations to be undertaken before the First World War and the Russian Revolution brought the luxury of archaeological excavation to a temporary end was at the kurgan of Soloka, on the banks of the river Dnieper in Ukraine. Work began in 1912. Although one burial chamber had been robbed, another was found intact, producing a remarkable collection of grave goods, including a now famous gold comb which depicts a battle between a foot soldier and 2 horsemen, one whose horse has just been killed. They were a mixture of Greek and Scythian armour, a conflation of styles reflected again by the Greek bronze helmet and greaves with which the dead king in the burial chamber had been provided. Putting it all together. The 8 decades of kurgan digging in the Ukraine and North Caucasus had provided an astonishing array of material reflecting the life of the Scythian elite in the Pontic region and their burial practices, which quite eclipsed the old Siberian collection. The Scythians had burst into the popular imagination, and scholars around the world were intrigued. The animal art of the nomads was surprising, even shocking, to those used to the familiar harmonies of the classical world. But it was the coexistence of these barbarians with the Greek colonists living on their shores, and the cultural interaction of the 2 different worlds that really caught the imagination. Many were drawn to write about it, among them a young Cambridge scholar, Ellis Minns, who after graduating spent 3 years in Russia studying the antiquities, art and history of the country. Returning to a comfortable academic life in Cambridge, he devoted himself to writing a massive tome, Scythians and Greeks, which was published in 1913. It was this book that introduced the Scythians to the English-speaking world, and it remains a seminal text. The other great name in the pioneering years of Scythian studies was the Russian-born Mikhail Rostovtsev. Rostovtsev left Russia during the 1917 revolution, living for a short while in Oxford before leaving in 1920 to make a new life for himself in America. From 1925 until his retirement in 1944, he taught ancient history at Yale. Before leaving Russia, his interests had included the anthropology and archaeology of South Russia and the Ukraine, and in his brief interlude in Oxford, he devoted himself to preparing material for 2 books, Iranians and Greeks in South Russia, published in 1922, and Scythian und der Bosphorus, which appeared 3 years later. In both ventures, he received the friendship and active encouragement of Ellis Minns. Thus it was that in the second decade of the 20th century, Scythian studies came of age. In 1923, a special journal, Scythica, was launched in Prague. One of the papers in the first volume, Central Asia, Russia and the Animal Style, was contributed by Rostovtsev. Meanwhile, in Siberia. The Russian fascination with Siberia in the 18th century led, as we have seen, to state-organized expeditions. As the potential of the region became better known and Russian authority was established, educated men gravitated to the area to settle and to work. One such was Petr Frolov, a trained mining engineer who, in 1793, was sent to the silver mine at Zmenogorsk in the Barnaul district, situated in the Altai mountains of Siberia. He worked in the mines until 1830, developing new machinery to improve efficiency, and among his many achievements built the first cast-iron railway in Russia, designed to move ore from the mine to the smelting works 2 kilometers away. To while away the long Siberian winters, he engaged in a wide range of cultural activities, collecting antiquities, geological samples, manuscripts, and scientific instruments. In 1823, in partnership with the explorer and ethnographer F. V. Gabler, he founded the Barnaul Mining Museum. Among the artifacts he was able to acquire from the local peasants were bone and wood carvings, mostly in Siberian animal style, which had been dug out of the kurgans. They dated from the 5th to 3rd centuries BC. What was remarkable was the unusual state of preservation of these organic materials. By the mid-19th century, Barnaul had become a thriving cultural center, its energy deriving from the rich deposits of copper and silver in the nearby mountains. One person attracted there was the German-born Vasily Radlov, who, as a young man, became a schoolteacher in the city. Radlov developed an interest in the ethnography and folklore of the region and went on to become an expert in the Turkic languages. Later in life, he played a part in the establishment of the Russian Museum of Ethnography and eventually, in 1884, became director of the Asiatic Museum in St. Petersburg. During his years in Barnaul, he would have become familiar with the wooden animal carvings from the Altai kurgans on display in the museum and, no doubt, heard stories about their discovery. In 1865, he decided to explore the kurgans for himself, choosing 2 for excavation, one near the village of Katanda and the other on the Beryl River. In both he found that the ground beneath the mound of stones of which the kurgan was constructed was permanently frozen, and it was this that had preserved all the organic material buried with the deceased in the wooden burial chamber below. Among the objects he recovered were wooden carvings, some of them covered with gold sheet, fur clothing and Chinese silk. It was an astonishing series of discoveries throwing entirely new light on nomadic life in the late 1st millennium BC. Coming at the time when the kurgans of the Pontic steppe were beginning to be explored, it provided a stark reminder of the vast area across which nomadic animal art had once extended, raising many questions, not least how the remarkable cultural connectivity which must have existed throughout the steppe related to the movements of people. Surprisingly, it was not until the 1920s that Radlov's discoveries were followed up, when a new expedition from the archaeological section of the Russian Museum at Leningrad, as St. Petersburg was renamed after the revolution, under the leadership of Sergei Rudenko, 1885 to 1969, was sent to make an archaeological survey of the High Altai. In 1927, a frozen tomb at Shib, dating to the 1st century BC, was examined by one of the team, Mikhail Gryaznov, 1902 to 1984. Here the body of the deceased was very well preserved, together with horse gear, gold appliques, and emblems cut from bark. 2 years later, at Pazyryk in the eastern Altai, Gryaznov opened a kurgan in a barrow cemetery that the expedition had discovered earlier in 1924. The preservation in the Pazyryk kurgan was exceptional. The timbers of the burial chamber and several layers of logs that had been piled above and around the chamber to deter robbers were perfectly preserved, as were the
Sample complete. Ready to continue?